Old money has a way of turning hearts to stone. Just ask Victoria Bradley, who spent 30 years crafting the perfect society family until her son brought home a ring and a revolution. They called Amara Thompson unsuitable, a working-class girl with too much pride and too dark a complexion for their world of country clubs and charity galas. What they didn't know was that she carried something more dangerous than pride: truth. Documents that could shatter the Bradley construction empire, expose decades of corruption, and prove that her own father's bankruptcy wasn't bad luck. It was punishment for his integrity. Now standing in a cathedral filled with whispered judgments and pristine prejudice, Amara holds more than just a bouquet. She holds the power to bring down an empire. But first, she has to say, "I do." Because sometimes the greatest act of love isn't saying yes to a man. It's standing up to his entire world. The Bradleys are about to learn that the hardest things to break aren't building codes or social barriers. It's the chains of privilege they never knew they wore. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The evening air was crisp, as Ethan led Amara through the winding path of Jefferson Park. String lights twinkled overhead, creating a magical canopy that reflected in her dark eyes. He'd chosen this moment carefully, wanting everything to be perfect. His heart thundered in his chest as they reached the garden pavilion, where he'd first asked her on a date 2 years ago. "Do you remember?" he asked softly, watching her face light up with recognition. "Of course I do," Amara laughed, squeezing his hand. "You were so nervous you nearly spilled your coffee all over yourself." Ethan pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her jasmine perfume. "I had good reason to be nervous. You were the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen." He paused, gathering his courage. "And you still are." Above them, stars pierced through the darkness, creating a natural spotlight for what would become one of the most important moments of their lives. Ethan took both of Amara's hands in his thumb brushing over her soft skin. "When I met you, my whole world changed," he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "You showed me what real love looks like, not the shallow, superficial kind I grew up around, but something deep and true." Amara's eyes widened as Ethan lowered himself to one knee. The velvet box seemed to materialize in his hands as if by magic, and when he opened it, the diamond caught the starlight, scattering tiny rainbows between them. "Amara Thompson, will you marry me?" The world seemed to hold its breath in that moment. Tears spilled down Amara's cheeks as she nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, yes, of course I will." Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger with trembling hands, then stood to pull her into a passionate kiss. They stayed in the pavilion for a long while, wrapped in each other's arms, sharing their dreams for the future. Later that evening, they celebrated at their favorite restaurant, a cozy Italian place where the owner knew them by name. Over plates of handmade pasta and glasses of wine, they talked about everything and nothing. "Your parents," Amara began hesitantly, twirling pasta around her fork. "How do you think they'll take it?" Ethan reached across the table to take her hand. "They'll come around. They have to. You're going to be their daughter-in-law." But even as he said the words, a knot formed in his stomach. He knew his parents, especially his mother Victoria, had certain expectations. The next evening, Ethan sat across from his parents in their formal dining room, the crystal chandelier casting sharp shadows across the mahogany table. His mother wore her usual string of pearls, while his father Charles had just returned from the office, still in his tailored suit. "I have some news," Ethan announced, setting down his fork. "I've asked Amara to marry me, and she said yes." The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria's hand froze halfway to her wine glass, while Charles's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Well," Victoria finally said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "That's unexpected." "Is it?" Ethan challenged, keeping his voice level. "We've been together for 2 years." "Of course not, darling. Victoria recovered quickly, but her knuckles were white around her wine stem. We're just surprised you didn't discuss it with us first. There are certain considerations. Charles cleared his throat. Your mother's right, son. Marriage is about more than just love. It's about family legacy, social standing. It's about being happy, Ethan cut in. And Amara makes me happier than I've ever been. Later that evening, Victoria cornered Ethan in the study. Sweetheart, I'm worried about you. Have you thought about how this will affect your position at the firm? People talk, and the Bradley name carries certain expectations. Mom, it's 2025. If anyone has a problem with who I marry, that's their issue, not mine. But his mother's words planted a seed of unease that he couldn't quite shake, even as he drove home that night. The scene at the Thompson house couldn't have been more different. Amara's family had gathered for their weekly Sunday barbecue, the backyard filled with the smell of Samuel's famous grilled ribs and the sound of soul music drifting from old speakers. When Amara announced their engagement, the celebration was immediate and genuine. Samuel swept his daughter into a bear hug, while Lorraine wiped happy tears from her eyes. Derek, Amara's brother, clapped Ethan on the back so hard he nearly stumbled. Welcome to the family, man, Derek said, but later pulled him aside near the grill. Look, I know what kind of world you come from. If anyone, and I mean anyone, tries to disrespect my sister or our family, I would never let that happen, Ethan assured him firmly. Amara's everything to me. The engagement dinner was Victoria's idea, a proper celebration at LeBlanc, one of the city's most exclusive restaurants. From the moment both families arrived, the atmosphere crackled with tension. Victoria had arranged the seating with surgical precision, Ethan's family on one side, Amara's on the other, like opposing armies at a medieval feast. She spent the first course peppering Amara's parents with questions that seemed innocent but carried barbs. Samuel, what exactly do you do again? Something in construction, was it? Samuel met her gaze steadily. I own a small construction company, started it from the ground up 20 years ago. How industrious, Charles commented, sharing a meaningful look with Victoria. There's something to be said for working-class grit. Wouldn't you agree, dear? Derek's fork clattered against his plate. And what exactly are you implying about our family? The restaurant seemed to grow quieter, other diners turning to watch the drama unfold. Ethan quickly stepped in, changing. On the drive home, silence filled the car until Amara finally spoke. Maybe your mother was right to worry about their reputation. Clearly, we're not good enough for the mighty Bradley family. Hey, no. Ethan pulled over, turning to face her. Don't let them get in your head. They're wrong, and they'll see that eventually. Our love is stronger than their prejudice. Amara managed a small smile, but Ethan could tell she wasn't convinced. He held her hand tightly, trying to convey all the love and certainty he felt, even as doubt gnawed at the edges of his own confidence. That night, as Amara lay awake in her bed, she thought about the way Victoria had looked at her family, like they were specimens under a microscope. She thought about Charles's barely concealed disdain, the way he'd emphasized working class like it was a disease. But mostly, she thought about Ethan, and whether their love really would be enough to bridge the chasm between their worlds. Meanwhile, in their mansion across town, Victoria sat at her desk, her laptop casting a blue glow across her face as she typed Thompson family background into a search engine. Her perfectly manicured nails clicked against the keys as she dug deeper, determined to find something, anything, she could use to protect her family's reputation. The engagement party had made one thing crystal clear. This wedding would either break down walls or build them higher. As the city slept, the battle lines were being drawn, and everyone involved knew that the coming months would test not just Ethan and Amara's love, but the very foundations of both families' beliefs and, though it was in her bedroom, Amara twisted her engagement ring around her finger, watching it catch the moonlight. The diamond sparkled just as it had in the park, but now its brilliance seemed to mock her, highlighting the vast difference between her world and Ethan's. Still, As she closed her eyes, she remembered the conviction in his voice when he'd proposed, the pure love in his eyes. Maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. Across town, Ethan lay in his own bed, scrolling through photos of him and Amara on his phone. Each image showed them laughing, loving, completely in sync with each other. He paused on one taken at a carnival last summer. Amara with cotton candy in her hair, both of them doubled over with laughter. This was real, he thought. This was worth fighting for. But as both of them drifted off to sleep that night, neither could shake the feeling that their engagement was just the beginning of a storm that would test them in ways they never expected. The question wasn't just whether their love would survive. It was whether it would be strong enough to change hearts that had been hardened by generations of prejudice and privilege. The morning sun filtered through the windows of the Bradley mansion as Victoria paced the living room, her heels clicking against the marble floor. She'd spent the week after the engagement dinner arranging this meeting with Eleanor Blackwood, the city's most sought-after wedding planner. As she waited for Ethan and Amara to arrive, she rehearsed her strategy for taking control of the wedding. Preparations. Amara and Ethan arrived hand in hand, their smiles fading slightly as they entered the formal space. Eleanor sat perched on the edge of an antique settee, her tablet ready and her expression professionally neutral. "Darlings," Victoria rushed forward, air-kissing both their cheeks. "Eleanor has cleared her entire morning for us. She's planned weddings for senators and CEOs. Only the best for our family." "Mom," Ethan started. "We were thinking of something simpler." "Nonsense," Victoria cut him off smoothly. "This is a Bradley wedding. Eleanor, show them the venue options you've selected." Eleanor's fingers danced across her tablet, pulling up images of grand ballrooms and historic mansions. Each venue was more opulent than the last, with price tags that made Amara's stomach turn. She thought of her mother's careful budgeting, of the savings her parents had set aside for this day. "These are all beautiful," Amara said carefully. "But we were hoping for something more intimate. Maybe the botanical gardens or..." "The botanical gardens." Victoria's laugh tinkled like breaking glass. "Dear, we need space for at least 5 across town, in the Thompsons' cozy living room." A very different planning session was taking place. Lorraine had spread craft supplies across the coffee table, while Samuel and Derek arranged chairs for the extended family members who'd come. "To help, remember my wedding to your father?" Lorraine asked Amara, who'd escaped the Bradley mansion for a few hours of peace. "Your Aunt Marie made all the centerpieces by hand. They were more beautiful than anything we could have bought." Aunt Marie nodded, holding up a sample centerpiece she'd created, an elegant arrangement of handcrafted paper flowers and fairy lights. "And these will last forever, baby. Your children can have them someday." Amara's eyes welled up as she touched one of the delicate petals. This was what she wanted, something meaningful, created with love. But Victoria's voice echoed in her head, reminding her of expectations and obligations. The next day, during another meeting with Eleanor, Victoria examined one of the handmade centerpieces Amara had brought to show. Her lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "How quaint," she said, setting it down like it might contaminate her. "Very rustic. But perhaps we should consider something more refined?" "Eleanor, show them the crystal centerpiece options." Lorraine's face fell when Amara reported this exchange later that evening. "Baby, don't let them make you feel ashamed of who we are and what we can offer." "I don't," Amara insisted, but her voice wavered. That night, she tried to talk to Ethan about feeling pushed aside in her own wedding planning. "Your mother keeps dismissing everything I suggest," she said, pacing their apartment. "It's like she doesn't see me as good enough to have opinions about my own wedding." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'll talk to her, okay? She's just excited and getting carried away." But his conversation with Victoria the next day was brief and ineffective. "Mother, you need to include Amara more in the planning." "I'm including her, darling. I simply know what's best for a wedding of this caliber. Now, about the guest list." What Ethan didn't know was that across town, in a discreet office building, Charles was meeting with James Morton, a private investigator, known for his thoroughness and discretion. "I need everything," Charles said, sliding an envelope across the desk. "Every detail about the Thompson family, no stone unturned." Morton picked up the envelope, noting its weight. "Any particular areas of concern?" "Financial history, criminal records, anything that might affect our family's reputation. This isn't just about protecting our name, it's about protecting my son from making a terrible mistake." The investigation proceeded quickly. Morton was good at his job, diving deep into records and interviews. Within days, he'd uncovered Samuel Thompson's bankruptcy from 15 years ago, filed after his first construction company failed during the recession. There was also a misdemeanor charge from Samuel's college days, a protest that had gotten out of hand. Charles received the report with grim satisfaction, but Victoria was the one who began weaponizing the information. She started with subtle questions during their weekly wedding planning sessions. "Amara, dear," she'd say, eyes innocently wide. "Your father's business seems to be doing well now. It must have been difficult, starting over after everything." Amara would stiffen, understanding the implication but refusing to take the bait. She sensed the hostility behind Victoria's polite smile but couldn't prove it. The tension came to a head during a cake tasting session. Victoria had invited several of her society friends, turning what should have been an intimate decision into a social spectacle. "Margaret, you remember the Wellington wedding last spring? Now that was elegance. Although I suppose not everyone appreciates traditional sophistication these days." Her eyes slid meaningfully toward Amara. Later that evening, Amara broke down in her mother's kitchen. "I don't know if I can do this, Mom. Everything I suggest is wrong. Everything about us is wrong in their eyes." Lorraine set aside the dinner, dishes, and took her daughter's hands. "Listen to me. Your father's bankruptcy? That happened because he refused to lay off his workers during the recession. He paid them from our savings until there was nothing left. Then he built everything back up, worker by worker, contract by contract. That's the kind of man who raised you. Don't you dare be ashamed of where you come from." Meanwhile, Ethan was having his own crisis of conscience. He'd overheard his parents in Charles's study, discussing the investigator's findings. "Dad, what the hell?" he burst in, fury radiating from every pore. "You hired someone to investigate Amara's family?" Charles barely looked up from his desk. "It's called due diligence, son. Something you should have done yourself before proposing." "Due diligence? They're not a corporate merger. They're going to be my family." "Exactly." Charles's voice was cold. "And as your family, we have a right to know who we're allowing into our lives." "Allowing?" Ethan's laugh was bitter. "You don't get to allow or disallow anything. This is my choice, my life." He stormed out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the family portraits lining the hallway. But as he drove home, his father's words echoed in his head, mixing with old insecurities and doubts. Victoria's campaign of subtle warfare continued. She began hosting weekly wedding coordination brunches, inviting her friends and deliberately excluding Lorraine with last-minute scheduling changes. She'd then apologize profusely, claiming miscommunication while her friends whispered behind their hands. Amara found herself dreading these events, where every comment contained a hidden barb. Every suggestion she made was politely, but firmly, dismissed. The wedding was growing larger, more elaborate, and less recognizable by the day. One afternoon, as Amara sat alone in her apartment reviewing the latest changes to the wedding plans, she felt overwhelmed by how far things had spiraled from her original vision. The intimate celebration of love she'd dreamed of had morphed into a society spectacle, a stage for Victoria to display her wealth and influence. She picked up her phone to call Ethan, then set it down again. He was trying, she knew that, but his attempts to stand up to his parents were always followed by quiet capitulation. It was as if he was caught between two worlds, unable to fully commit to either one. A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. It was Derek, holding a bag of their mother's famous comfort food. "Thought you could use this," he said. setting up containers of mac and cheese and sweet potato pie on her coffee table. "You've been looking rough lately, sis," Amara managed, a weak smile. "Is it that obvious? To people who love you?" "Yeah." He settled beside her on the couch. "You know you don't have to go through with this, right? No one would blame you for walking away." "Love shouldn't make you smaller," he countered. "Every time I see you at one of their fancy events, it's like watching you fold yourself into a smaller and smaller box, trying to fit into their world." Tears slipped down Amara's cheeks as she leaned against her brother's shoulder. "I don't know what to do. Every time I think they're starting to accept me, something happens to show me they never will. Then maybe it's time to stop trying to be accepted and start demanding respect." Sayo. Next day, Victoria arranged another meeting with Eleanor to discuss the wedding favors. Amara had suggested handmade soaps from a local artisan who employed formerly incarcerated women, helping them rebuild their lives. "Oh, darling." Victoria's smile was sharp as a knife. "We couldn't possibly. What would people think?" "No, Eleanor has sourced these lovely crystal champagne flutes from Italy." Amara stared at the sample flute, its price tag equal to a month's rent in her old apartment. Something inside her snapped. "People would think we care about our community," she said quietly but firmly. "They'd think we understand that true value isn't about price tags or appearances." Victoria's smile froze. "I don't think you understand the standards we need to maintain." "I understand perfectly," Amara cut her off, standing up. "I understand that nothing I am, nothing my family is, will ever be good enough for you. But here's what you don't understand. We don't need your approval." She walked out of the meeting, leaving Victoria and Eleanor in stunned silence. Her hands shook as she drove to her parents' house, but her spine was straight and her head was high. Samuel was in the backyard, tending to Lorraine's vegetable garden when Amara arrived. One look at her face and he knew something was wrong. "Come help your old man with these tomatoes," he said, patting the ground beside him. As they worked together in comfortable silence, he finally spoke. "You know, when I lost everything during the recession, a lot of people looked at me the way Victoria looks at us now, like we were somehow less than human because we struggled." He picked up a ripe tomato, holding it up to the sun. "But struggle teaches you what's real. Money comes and goes, but character, that's something no one can take from you." Amara looked at her father's hands, strong and calloused from years of hard work. She thought about Victoria's manicured fingers recoiling from the handmade centerpiece, about Charles's dismissive tone when discussing Samuel's business. "How do you stay so strong, Daddy?" Samuel smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Because I know who I am and where I come from. The question is, do you know who you are, baby girl?" As the sun set over the garden, Amara felt something settle in her heart. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she knew one thing. She was done trying to shrink herself to fit into the Bradleys' world. That evening, when Ethan came over, she was ready to talk. "We need to decide what kind of marriage we're going to have," she said. "One where we stand together against prejudice, or one where we pretend it doesn't exist." Ethan pulled her close, pressing his forehead to hers. "Together," he whispered. "Always together." But as they held each other, neither could ignore the growing storm clouds on the horizon. The wedding was still months away, and Victoria's quiet investigation into the Thompson family was about to yield results that would test their love in ways they never imagined. Morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Charles Bradley's home office as he arranged the manila envelope's contents across his mahogany desk. His son sat across from him, jaw clenched, as Charles methodically laid out the evidence of Samuel Thompson's past. A bankruptcy, Ethan, and this charge from his college days, disturbing the peace during a protest. Is this really the kind of family you want to associate with? Charles's voice carried the practiced calm of a man used to delivering devastating news in boardrooms. Ethan's fingers curled around the armrests of his chair. A bankruptcy from trying to save his workers' jobs, Dad, and a protest charge from standing up for what he believed in. If anything, these papers prove exactly why I want to marry into their family. Charles leaned back, studying his son with the same calculating gaze he used on opposing counsel. You're not seeing the bigger picture. The Bradley name opens doors. Doors that will slam shut the moment you tie yourself to someone like her. Someone like her? Ethan stood so abruptly his chair scraped against the hardwood floor. Just say what you really mean, Dad. This isn't about bankruptcy or old protest charges. This is about the color of her skin. Don't be dramatic, Charles dismissed with a wave of his hand. This is about maintaining the social standing our family has built over generations. Your children will be loved. Ethan cut him off. Something you might want to try sometime. He stormed out, leaving Charles staring at the scattered papers that had cost him thousands in private investigator fees and his son's respect. Across town, Victoria had orchestrated what she called a casual lunch with Amara at Le Petit Jardin, the kind of restaurant where casual meant $100 entrees and sommelier-selected wine pairings. Amara sat stiffly in her chair, already sensing the trap being laid. You know, Victoria began, delicately cutting into her salmon, every family has its secrets. The question is how we handle them when they come to light. Her eyes fixed on Amara with predatory focus. Your father's financial history, for instance. Amara set down her fork, her appetite vanishing. My father's past isn't a secret. It's a testament to his character. Character. Victoria laughed softly. Is that what we're calling it now? Darling, in our world, character is measured by reliability, stability. In your world, maybe. Amara interrupted, her voice steady despite her racing heart. In mine, it's measured by how you treat people, especially when times are hard. Victoria's perfectly painted lips curved into a cold smile. Times are about to get very hard indeed if you continue with this arrangement. Do you really want to drag Ethan down with you? Amara stood, dropping her napkin onto her untouched plate. The only thing dragging Ethan down is the weight of his parents' prejudice. She walked out, head held high, leaving Victoria to deal with the stares of nearby diners. Unknown to either of them, Derek had been having lunch at the same restaurant, hidden behind a large potted plant. His blood boiled as he listened to Victoria's thinly veiled threats. He found Amara in the parking lot, hands shaking as she tried to unlock her car. I heard everything, he said, making her jump. Sis, you can't let them manipulate you like this. What choice do I have? Amara's voice cracked. They're going to keep digging, keep trying to prove we're not good enough. Then maybe it's time we did some digging of our own. That evening, Ethan arrived at Amara's apartment, his face drawn, with worry. We need to talk about what happened with my mom today. Which part? Amara asked bitterly. The part where she threatened me? Or the part where she made it clear your family will never accept mine? They'll come around, Ethan insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. They just need time. Time. For what? To find more ways to humiliate my family? To dig up more dirt from our past? She paced the small living room. Your father hired a private investigator, Ethan. A private investigator. I know, and I told him it was wrong. Telling him isn't enough anymore. Amara's voice rose with frustration. Every time they cross a line, you say you'll handle it, but nothing changes. They just get bolder, more determined to prove we're beneath you. Ethan tried to pull her into his arms, but she stepped back. I love you, he said softly. Isn't that enough? Love without action is just words, Amara replied, echoing something her father always said. Meanwhile, Charles was in his study, reviewing a presentation for tomorrow's board meeting when his phone buzzed. It was James Morton, the private investigator. Mr. Bradley, there's something else you should know about Samuel Thompson. Morton's voice crackled through the speaker. After the bankruptcy, he tried to expose some questionable practices in the construction industry, made some powerful enemies. Charles leaned forward, interest piqued. Go on. Thing is, during my investigation, I discovered some interesting parallels between those practices and some of your company's past projects. The phone nearly slipped from Charles's suddenly sweaty palm. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything, Mr. Bradley. Just sharing information, like you paid me to do. After hanging up, Charles sat in the darkening study, thinking about how close Samuel Thompson had come to uncovering his own company's shortcuts years ago. He'd buried the evidence deep, but if someone knew where to look. The next day, Samuel asked Ethan to meet him at a small diner, the kind of place where the coffee was strong and the conversations stronger. Ethan arrived to find his future father-in-law already seated in a corner booth, hands wrapped around a steaming mug. "Son," Samuel began without preamble, "I hear your father's been asking questions about my past." Ethan's face flushed with shame. "I'm so sorry about that. He had no right." Samuel held up a hand. "I'm not here for apologies. I'm here to tell you the whole story, straight from the source." He took a deep breath. "That bankruptcy your father's so interested in? It happened because I discovered some major safety violations in several big construction projects. When I tried to report it, suddenly my company's loans got called in. Contracts disappeared overnight." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. "What kind of violations?" "The kind that could kill people if the wrong beam gives way or the wrong foundation shifts." Samuel's eyes held Ethan steadily. "Your father's company was involved in some of those projects." The implications hit Ethan like a physical blow. "Did you ever find proof?" "Almost. But then the bankruptcy happened, and suddenly I had more immediate concerns, like keeping a roof over my family's head." Samuel smiled sadly. "Your father probably thinks that bankruptcy makes me look bad. Truth is, it's one of my proudest moments. Showed me what I was." As Ethan drove home, his father's words about protecting the family legacy took on a darker meaning. He thought about Amara, about the life they were planning together, and wondered how many other secrets lurked beneath the polished surface of his family's success. That evening, Charles was working late at his office when his assistant buzzed him. "Sir, there's someone here to see you. Says it's about some old construction projects." Charles's blood ran cold. "Send them in." The man who entered was older, weathered by years of construction work. "Mr. Bradley," he said quietly. "I used to work for Samuel Thompson. Been carrying something heavy for a long time and seeing how your family's treating his daughter. Well, maybe it's time to set that weight down." He placed a thick envelope on Charles's desk before walking out. Inside, Charles found documents that made his hands shake. Proof of every corner cut, every inspection bought, every safety regulation ignored in the name of profit. Meanwhile, Victoria had invited several of her society friends over for an evening of wedding planning, which really meant gossip thinly disguised as concern. "I just worry about Ethan's future," she confided, sipping her Chardonnay. "The business world can be so unforgiving of unconventional choices." "Have you considered a prenuptial agreement?" suggested Margaret Whitmore, her oldest friend. "Something to protect the family assets?" Before Victoria could respond, her phone buzzed with a text from Charles. "We need to talk, now." Across town, Amara received an unexpected delivery, a plain, brown envelope with no return address. Inside were copies of documents that made her gasp: inspection reports, emails, financial records, all pointing to years of corruption within Bradley Construction. She stayed up all night reading, her heart growing heavier with each page. This was the proof her father had sought years ago, the evidence that could explain why his small company had been suddenly crushed, but using it would mean declaring all-out war with Ethan's family. The next morning, during another tense family dinner at the Bradley mansion, Charles made a careless comment about Samuel's questionable choices in business. The room grew quiet as Ethan slowly set down his fork. "Interesting choice of words, Dad," he said coldly. "Want to talk about questionable business choices? Because I had a very enlightening conversation with Samuel today." Victoria's wine glass froze halfway to her lips. "Ethan, darling, this isn't the time." "When is the time, Mom? After you've thoroughly humiliated my fiancée and her family? After you've dug up every piece of dirt you can find while hiding your own secrets?" The ensuing argument was explosive. Accusations flew across the formal dining room like missiles, years of prejudice and pretense finally cracking open to reveal the rot beneath. Lorraine found Amara in their kitchen later that night, the damning documents spread across the table. "Baby girl," she said softly, "what are you going to do with all this?" "I don't know," Amara admitted. "Using it makes me no better than them, but keeping quiet?" She trailed off, thinking of her father's struggle, of all the workers who might have been put at risk. Lorraine sat beside her. The next morning, Lorraine requested a private meeting with Victoria. They met at a quiet coffee shop, neutral territory in the ongoing family war. "I won't pretend to understand why you hate us so much," Lorraine began, her voice calm but firm. "But I want you to understand something. Every time you look down on our family, every time you dismiss us as beneath you, you're telling my daughter that she should be ashamed of who she is and where she comes from." Victoria opened her mouth to protest, but Lorraine held up a hand. "I'm not finished. You can hire all the private investigators you want, dig up every struggle we've ever faced. But here's what you'll find. A family that stands together, that chooses integrity over profit, and love over prejudice. Can you say the same?" The question hung in the air between them, unanswered. Victoria left the coffee shop shaken, her carefully constructed worldview beginning to crack around the edges. That evening, as Amara sat alone in her apartment, staring at the envelope that could destroy the Bradley family's reputation, she felt the weight of every choice that had led to this moment. The evidence in her hands represented more than just corporate wrongdoing. It was a test of her own character. Would she use it to seek revenge against those who had hurt her family? Or was there a better way to bridge the chasm between their worlds? As night fell over the city, both families grappled with their secrets and choices. The coming days would test not just their love and loyalty, but their fundamental beliefs about justice, redemption, and the true meaning of family. The stage was set for a confrontation that would either heal deep wounds or create new ones that might never mend. And somewhere in the middle stood Ethan and Amara, their love caught in the crossfire of a battle that had begun long before they met. The grand ballroom of the Rosewood Hotel sparkled with crystal chandeliers and gilded mirrors, a fitting stage for what would become one of the most tension-filled evenings of Ethan and Amara's engagement. The rehearsal dinner was Victoria's crowning achievement in wedding planning, every detail calculated to showcase the Bradley family's wealth and status. Amara stood in the entrance, her hand tight in Ethan's, watching the two families arrive. The divide was immediately apparent. The Bradleys' friends and designer evening wear clustering on one side, the Thompson family and their guests on the other, like opposing armies at a medieval feast. "You look beautiful," Ethan whispered, squeezing her hand. Amara smiled, smoothing the silk of her burgundy dress, a dress she'd chosen despite Victoria's not-so-subtle suggestions about wearing something more appropriate from her recommended designer. Samuel and Lorraine arrived, looking elegant but clearly uncomfortable in the opulent setting. Lorraine wore a stunning blue dress she'd made herself, while Samuel's suit was perfectly tailored, a gift from his construction company's employees for the occasion. "Baby girl," Samuel wrapped Amara in a warm hug. "You're glowing." Before she could respond, Victoria's voice cut through the moment like a knife. "Oh my, Lorraine, that's quite an interesting dress. Did you really make it yourself? How resourceful." The comment, deliberately loud enough for nearby guests to hear, drew poorly concealed snickers from Victoria's friends. Lorraine straightened her spine, years of dealing with such microaggressions evident in her composed response. "Yes, I did. I find there's something special about creating things with your own hands. But then, not everyone appreciates that kind of effort." Charles appeared, champagne in hand, scanning Amara's family with barely concealed disdain. "Quite. Turnout from the working class tonight. I trust the valet can handle all those pickup trucks?" Derek, who'd been talking with cousins nearby, spun around. "What exactly are you implying about our family?" "Derek," Amara warned, but her brother was already advancing toward Charles. No, let's hear it, Derek's voice carried across the ballroom. Tell us exactly what you think about the people who actually build the buildings you profit from. The room fell silent, all pretense of polite society dropping away. Charles's face reddened, whether from anger or embarrassment wasn't clear. Young man, you clearly don't understand how things work in our world. Your world? Derek laughed bitterly. You mean the world built on the backs of people like my father? The world where you can hire private investigators to dig up dirt on honest people while hiding your own secrets? Lorraine stepped forward, her natural grace drawing all eyes. This isn't the time or place, she said firmly, placing a calming hand on Derek's arm. We're here to celebrate Ethan and Amara's love, nothing else. The tension eased slightly, but the damage was done. As guests moved toward their assigned tables, the whispers began. Victoria's carefully orchestrated evening was already fraying at the edges. Eleanor Blackwood, the wedding planner, tried to redirect attention to the schedule of events, but even her professional polish couldn't smooth over the growing discord. She'd just begun reviewing the ceremony details when one of Victoria's friends made a loud comment about certain people not knowing their place. Samuel stood, his chair scraping against the marble floor. The room fell silent again as all eyes turned to him. But instead of anger, his face showed only sadness. You know, he said quietly, I've spent my life building things. Homes, offices, schools, places where people live and work and grow. And in all those years, I've learned that the strongest foundations aren't built with money or social status. They're built with integrity, respect, and love. He looked directly at Charles. Something you might want to consider before you judge. The worth of my family. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan found himself standing, moved by his future father-in-law's words and ashamed of his own family's behavior. Dad, he called across the room. A word? Charles followed Ethan into a quiet corner of the ballroom, his expression guarded. Son, you need to control your future in-laws. This display is exactly what I was worried about. Stop. Ethan's voice was low but firm. Just stop. Do you hear? Yourself? They're not the ones who need to be controlled. They're not the ones hiring investigators or making snide comments or treating people like they're beneath them. I'm trying to protect you. From what? From people who value family over money? From a woman who loves me for who I am, not what our name means? Ethan ran a hand through his hair in frustration. Do you want to know what I overheard you saying to Richard Bennett earlier? About my wedding being a mistake? Charles's face paled slightly. You don't understand the complexities. I understand perfectly. You're so worried about protecting our family's reputation that you can't see you're destroying our actual family. Meanwhile, Amara had found a quiet moment alone in the hotel's garden terrace, trying to gather her strength. The weight of the evidence she carried about Bradley Construction felt heavier than ever. There you are. Samuel's voice came from behind her. He joined her at the railing, looking out over the city lights. Quite a night. I'm sorry, Daddy. I never wanted to put our Hey now. He turned her gently to face him. You have nothing to be sorry for. You know what I see when I look at you? I see a woman strong enough to love despite prejudice, wise enough to know her worth, and brave enough to stand up for what's right. Tears spilled down Amara's cheeks. But what if love isn't enough? What if no matter what we do, they'll never accept us? Then that's their loss. Samuel pulled her into a hug. You don't need their acceptance to be worthy of love. Back inside, Victoria was overheard making another cutting remark about marrying into responsibility, a direct dig at Amara's family background. That was the final straw for Ethan. He strode to the center of the room, calling for everyone's attention. The chattering crowd fell silent, sensing the gravity of the moment. I've spent weeks watching my parents try to undermine my relationship with Amara, he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. I've listened to their thinly veiled insults, watched them dig into her family's past, and stood by as they tried to turn our wedding into some kind of social statement. Victoria started to speak, but Ethan held up his hand. "No, Mom. You've done enough talking. Now it's my turn." He moved to stand beside Amara, taking her hand. "This woman, this brilliant, strong, beautiful woman, has shown me what real love looks like. Her family has shown me what real integrity looks like. And I'm done pretending that your prejudice is anything but what it is: ugly, small-minded, and completely contrary to everything I want in my life." The silence in the room was absolute. Charles stood rigid with anger, while Victoria's face had lost all color. "If anyone here has a problem with my choice of bride," Ethan continued, "with her family, her background, or anything else about her, there's the door. Because I choose her, all of her, including her family, her values, and every single thing." "You've tried to criticize." Derek, who had been watching the scene unfold, felt a newfound respect for his future brother-in-law. Maybe, he thought, there was hope after all. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of tension and whispered conversations. Victoria's carefully planned schedule fell apart as guests began leaving early, the atmosphere too uncomfortable to ignore. Later, that night, in their apartment, Amara sat on their bed, still in her rehearsal dinner dress. "Did you mean what you said? About choosing me, no matter what?" Ethan knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "Every word. I'm done trying to please them. From now on, we do this our way." But even as they held each other, both knew that the worst was yet to come. The envelope of evidence still sat in Amara's desk drawer, a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. The next morning, Victoria made one last attempt to regain control. She arrived at Amara's apartment unannounced, armed with a stack of bridal magazines and a brittle smile. "Darling, about last night," she began, but Amara cut her off. "No more, Victoria. No more pretending. No more subtle digs. No more attempts to make me feel small. I love your son, and I'm going to marry him. You can either accept that and treat my family with respect, or you can stay away from the wedding entirely." Victoria's mask slipped, revealing the anger beneath. "You have no idea what you're doing to this family." "I know exactly what I'm doing," Amara replied calmly. "I'm showing your son that love doesn't come with conditions. That family isn't about social status or bank accounts. It's about standing together, supporting each other, and choosing what's." That evening, as both families retreated to their separate corners of the city, the weight of everything left unsaid hung in the air. The rehearsal dinner had brought every tension, every prejudice, every hidden feeling into the light. Ethan lay, awake in bed, thinking about his father's words about mistakes and family legacy. Beside him, Amara stared at the ceiling, the envelope of evidence seeming to pulse with possibility in her drawer. Across town, Charles sat in his study, drinking scotch and wondering how it had all gone so wrong. Victoria paced their bedroom, her perfect world crumbling around her. And in the Thompson home, Samuel and Lorraine held each other close, proud of their daughter's strength but worried about the storm they could all feel coming. The wedding was just days away, and everyone knew that something had to give. The question was no longer if there would be a confrontation, but when, and who would be left standing in its wake. Dawn broke over the city on Amara and Ethan's wedding day, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Amara sat at her childhood bedroom desk, reading the letter her mother had slipped under her door earlier that morning. Lorraine's elegant handwriting filled the pages with wisdom and love. "My dearest daughter," the letter began, "as you prepare to walk down the aisle, today, remember this: your worth isn't measured by those who reject you, but by the strength of your spirit and the love in your heart. You come from a line of women who refused to bow to prejudice, who stood tall in the face of adversity. Today, you carry that legacy forward." Tears splashed onto the paper as Amara read, smudging the ink slightly. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, quickly wiping her eyes. Lorraine entered, already dressed in her mother-of-the-bride gown, carrying a small wooden box. I have something for you, baby girl. Inside the box lay a delicate pearl necklace, simple but elegant. Your grandmother wore this at her wedding, Lorraine explained, her voice thick. With emotion, she married your grandfather when interracial marriage was still illegal in some states. They had to drive 3 states over just to say their vows. As Lorraine fastened the necklace around her daughter's neck, their eyes met in the mirror. You're carrying her strength today, and mine, and that of every woman in our family who chose love over fear. Across town, Ethan stood in his father's study, making one last attempt at reconciliation. Charles sat behind his massive desk, his IK position a clear reminder of the power dynamic he wished to maintain. Dad, please. Ethan's voice was tired. It's my wedding day. Can't you just set aside your prejudice for one day? Charles's face remained impassive. This isn't about prejudice, son. This is about family legacy, about maintaining the standards. That what? Ethan interrupted. That keep us isolated in our bubble of privilege? That let us look down on people who actually work for their success instead of inheriting it? You're young, Charles dismissed. You don't understand how the world works. No, Dad, I understand perfectly. I just choose not to accept it. The sprawling cathedral buzzed with activity as guests began arriving. Victoria had insisted on the grand venue, calling it traditional, though her real motivation had been to emphasize the gap between the family's social standings. The Thompson side filled with a vibrant mix of family and friends. Samuel's, construction workers in their best suits, Lorraine's sewing circle members, neighbors who'd watched Amara grow up. The Bradley side was a sea of designer labels and subtle judgment. In the bride's room, Amara's bridesmaids helped her into her gown, an elegant creation that combined modern style with subtle touches, honoring her family's heritage. The pearls from her grandmother gleamed at her throat. Derek poked his head. Sis, you look... He trailed off, overwhelmed by emotion. Then his expression shifted. You should know. I overheard Charles talking to some of his business friends in the vestibule. He's still at it, making comments about our family. Amara closed her eyes briefly, centering herself. The envelope of evidence was in her small bridle. Clutch, a weight she'd carried with her, unsure until this moment if she would use it. The ceremony began traditionally enough. The string quartet played canon in D as the bridal party processed down the aisle. Samuel waited to walk his daughter down the aisle, his eyes shining with pride and unshed tears. But just as they began their walk, Charles's voice carried clearly across the hushed cathedral. At least the father of the bride managed to afford a decent suit this time, better than the bargain basement clothes they usually wear. The comment, deliberately loud enough to be heard by nearby guests, sent a ripple of shocked murmurs through the congregation. Samuel's step faltered slightly, but his head remained high. That was when Ethan stepped away from the altar. The string quartet faltered, then fell silent. Enough, his voice echoed through the vaulted space. I have spent months watching you and Mom try to tear down the woman I love and her family. I've listened to your thinly veiled racist comments, watched you dig into their past, seen you try to humiliate them at every turn. Victoria stood from her front row seat. Ethan, darling, this isn't the time. This is exactly the time, he cut her off. Because I'm done. Done pretending your behavior is anything but disgusting. Done watching you hurt people I love. Done being part of a family that values status over humanity. Amara moved to stand beside him, her father close behind. She opened her clutch and removed the envelope. Since you're so interested in digging up people's pasts, she said clearly, let's talk about Bradley Construction's history of cutting corners on safety regulations. Let's discuss the bribes, the falsified inspection reports, the workers put at risk. She began distributing copies of the documents to nearby guests. Charles's face drained of color as he recognized the papers. These prove that while my father was going bankrupt trying to protect his workers, Amara continued, your company was actively endangering lives to save money. The bankruptcy you love to mock him for. It happened because he refused to stay quiet about your corruption. The cathedral erupted in chaos. Victoria tried to snatch the papers from guests' hands, but it was too late. The evidence was clear. Years of systematic corruption laid bare. "How dare you?" Charles thundered, starting down the aisle. "You have no right, no right." Samuel's voice cut through the chaos. "No right to expose how you nearly destroyed my business because I wouldn't play along with your schemes? No right to show everyone that while you were looking down on my family, you were building your fortune on lies and corruption?" Ethan faced his father. "Is it true? Did you really try to ruin Samuel's business because he threatened to expose you?" Charles's silence was all the confirmation needed. All this time, Ethan's laugh was bitter. "You've acted like the Thompsons weren't good enough for our family, but they're everything we pretend to be. Honorable, hardworking, honest. They built their lives on integrity while we built ours on lies." Victoria made one last attempt to maintain control. "Think about what you're doing to our family name." "Our family name?" Ethan turned to address the gathered guests. "Let me tell you about family names. Samuel Thompson's name means something, because he earned it, through hard work, integrity, and sacrifice. The Bradley name? We inherited it, and then we corrupted it. Well, I'm done being part of that corruption." He turned to Amara, taking her hands in his. "I love you, and I'm proud to be marrying into your family. If anyone here has a problem with that, they can leave. Right now." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of shoes on marble, as Charles and Victoria walked out of the cathedral, their social circle awkwardly following. Amara looked at Ethan, her eyes shining with tears and determination. "Are you sure about this? They're your family." "No," he said firmly. "You're my family, your parents, who welcomed me with open arms despite knowing what my parents are like. They're my family. Derek, who was ready to fight anyone who disrespected you, he's my family. I choose love over hate, integrity over privilege, truth over comfortable lies." Samuel stepped forward, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Son, are you absolutely certain? There's no going back from this." "I've never been more certain of anything," Ethan replied. "Now, if everyone's okay with it, I'd really like to marry your daughter." The ceremony that followed was nothing like Victoria's carefully planned society event. It was real, raw, and filled with more genuine emotion than any Bradley function had ever seen. When Samuel walked Amara down the aisle, every step was a testament to dignity in the face of prejudice. When Lorraine read a passage about love's power to overcome all obstacles, her voice carried the weight of personal experience. The vows Ethan and Amara exchanged weren't just promises to each other. They were declarations of what they stood for, what they were willing to fight for, what they believed in. "I promise to stand with you against any storm," Ethan said, his voice carrying to every corner of the cathedral. "To fight alongside you for what's right, to build a life based on love and integrity, not privilege and prejudice." Amara's vows were equally powerful. "I promise to love you not despite our differences, but because of how we've overcome them. To build a future that honors both our pasts while breaking free from their limitations." As they exchanged rings, the remaining guests, those who had chosen to stay, witnessed something remarkable. The formation not just of a marriage, but of a statement about what really matters in life. The reception that followed was smaller than planned, but filled with genuine joy. Samuel's construction workers shared tables with corporate executives who had chosen principle over social connection. Lorraine's friends mixed with society ladies who had decided to break ranks with Victoria's crowd. During the father-daughter dance, Samuel held Amara close. "I've never been more proud of you, baby girl. You stood up not just for yourself, but for what's right." "I learned from the best," she whispered back. Later, as Ethan and Amara shared their first dance as husband and wife, they knew their journey was far from over. Charles's business dealings would face scrutiny, social circles would be redrawn, and their stand against prejudice would have lasting repercussions. But as they moved across the dance floor, surrounded by people who had chosen love over hate, truth over pretense, and courage over the wedding that began as Victoria's attempt to showcase the Bradley family's social status had become something far more meaningful, a declaration of independence from prejudice, a victory of integrity over corruption, and a testimony to love's power to break down walls. As the evening drew to a close, Derek raised his glass for a final toast. To my sister and her husband, thank you for showing us that real change is possible, that love can triumph over prejudice, and that sometimes the hardest road is also the most worthwhile. Ethan and Amara left the reception hand in hand, stepping out into a future they would build on their own terms. Behind them, they left a changed landscape, one where truth had overcome lies, love had conquered hate, and courage had defeated fear. The stars that had witnessed their engagement months ago now shone down on a very different couple, stronger for the battles they'd fought, more certain of their path, and ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, together. The Monday morning after the wedding dawned cold and gray, matching the atmosphere in Charles Bradley's corner office as he watched. News vans gather outside Bradley Construction's headquarters. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing since Saturday. Board members demanding explanations, clients putting projects on hold, reporters seeking comments about the exposed documents. The door opened without a knock, and James Morton, the private investigator he'd hired to dig into the Thompsons, walked in. Charles's hand instinctively moved toward his desk drawer, where he kept his emergency bourbon. "I wouldn't bother with the drink," Morton said, settling uninvited into a leather chair. "You'll want a clear head for what's coming." "What do you want?" Charles's voice was hoarse from hours of damage control calls. "Insurance." Morton placed a USB drive on the desk. "See, while I was investigating Samuel Thompson, I found some interesting connections. Turns out I'm not the only one who's been tracking your company's creative business practices." Before Charles could respond, his assistant buzzed through. "Sir, the board of directors has called an emergency meeting. They're waiting in the main conference room." Across town, in the Thompsons' backyard, an impromptu gathering was taking place. Workers from Samuel's construction company mingled with former employees of Bradley Construction, sharing stories and comparing notes. A man named Mike Jenkins, who'd worked for both companies, stood to address the group. "Mr. Thompson," he called out, drawing everyone's attention. "That evidence your daughter revealed at the wedding? It barely scratches the surface. I've got files going back 15 years, records of every shortcut, every bribe, every inspection that got swept under the rug." Samuel raised his hand, silencing the murmurs that followed. "Mike, I appreciate you coming forward, but this isn't about revenge." "No," Mike agreed. "It's about justice. Those shortcuts nearly got my crew killed when that support beam gave way. Last year, the company blamed it on worker error, but we all knew the truth. They'd used substandard materials to cut costs. More workers began speaking up, each with their own story of safety violations and close calls. As Samuel listened, he realized this was bigger than his personal history with Charles Bradley. This was about protecting workers across the industry. Meanwhile, Victoria sat alone in her perfectly decorated living room, watching her carefully curated social world crumble through her phone screen. Society friends were already distancing themselves, charity board positions were being reorganized, and the country club had quietly suggested a temporary pause in their membership. A knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find Margaret Whitmore, her oldest friend and biggest social rival, standing there with an odd expression. "I suppose you've come to gloat," Victoria said bitterly. Margaret stepped inside, closing the door. "Actually, I've come to tell you something you need to hear. I was wrong about the Thompsons. We all were. And watching your son stand up against prejudice made me realize how much energy we've wasted maintaining these artificial barriers." Victoria sank onto her sofa. "My whole life, everything I've built, was built on excluding people like Amara and her family," Margaret finished gently. "Maybe it's time to build something new." At the local courthouse, Ethan sat in a private meeting with the district attorney, laying out everything he knew about his father's business practices. Each word felt like both a betrayal and a liberation. "I should have spoken up sooner," he admitted. "But I never had proof until Amara found those documents." The DA, a stern-faced woman named Sarah Martinez, leaned forward. "Mr. Bradley, what you're describing goes beyond simple corruption. These safety violations put hundreds of workers at risk. If you're willing to testify..." "I'll do whatever it takes to make this right," Ethan said firmly. "And it's just Ethan now. I'm done hiding behind the Bradley name." In their modest new apartment, Amara was unpacking wedding gifts when Derek arrived with unexpected news. "Sis, you won't believe this. Remember that mysterious guest at the wedding who had extra evidence against Charles?" Amara nodded, carefully, wrapping a hand-painted serving bowl from her aunt. "Turns out he was part of a group of former Bradley construction workers who've been gathering evidence for years. They were just waiting for the right moment to come forward. Your wedding gave them that moment." "I never meant to start all this," Amara said softly. "No," Derek agreed. "You just meant to stand up for what's right. Everything else is just dominoes falling where they should have fallen long ago." Back at Bradley Construction, the board meeting was going exactly as Charles had feared. 15 men and women in expensive suits sat around the mahogany conference table, their faces ranging from disappointed to openly hostile. "The evidence is overwhelming," board member William Pierce was saying. "Falsified safety reports, bribed inspectors, substandard materials, and now workers are coming forward with even more allegations." "I was protecting our profit margins," Charles protested weakly. "You were gambling with people's lives," Sarah Chen, another board member, cut in. "And now you've gambled away this company's reputation." The vote was unanimous. Charles Bradley was out, effective immediately. As security escorted him from the building he'd ruled for decades, reporters shouted questions about corruption, worker safety, and his son's public denouncement. That evening, Samuel received an unexpected call. It was Roger Matthews, the CEO of one of the city's largest development firms. "Mr. Thompson," Matthews began, "I've been following recent events with interest. Your stand against corruption in the industry, your history of protecting workers. We need more of that. I'd like to discuss a partnership." Samuel sat down heavily, in his kitchen chair. "A partnership? Your company's expertise in ethical construction practices, combined with our resources. We could set new industry standards for worker safety and corporate responsibility." Later that night, the Thompsons hosted a family dinner. Ethan and Amara were there, along with Derek and several aunts and uncles. The conversation inevitably turned to the day's events. "Did you hear?" Lorraine asked as she passed the cornbread. "Victoria was asked to resign from 3 charity boards today." "Mom," Amara protested, "that's not something to celebrate." "No," Lorraine agreed. "But change is. Real change, not just pretty words and empty promises." After dinner, Ethan helped with the dishes, a task that would have scandalized his mother. As he and Amara worked side by side in the kitchen, he felt a deep sense of peace. "Any regrets?" she asked softly. "About choosing you?" "Never. About not exposing my father's corruption sooner?" "Every day." Amara dried her hands and turned to face him. "You did the right thing when it mattered most. That's what counts." Across the city, Victoria sat in her darkened study, looking at old family photos, the perfectly posed Christmas cards, the carefully orchestrated vacation shots, each one a testament to the facade she'd spent her life maintaining. Her phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. "Lunch tomorrow? There's a soul food place downtown. That makes amazing fried chicken. Time for new experiences." Victoria stared at the message for a long moment before typing back, "Yes." Meanwhile, Charles faced his own moment of reckoning in his home office. The family lawyer had just left after delivering devastating news. The district attorney was preparing criminal charges. Years of corruption were about to become public record. He picked up a framed photo from his desk. Ethan's college graduation. They were both smiling, but now he could see the distance that had already been growing between them. His phone rang. The caller ID showed unknown, but he knew it would be another reporter, another former employee, another piece of his carefully constructed world falling apart. Back at the Thompson house, Derek was sharing his own news. "All this has inspired me," he told the family. "I'm starting a nonprofit focused on worker safety and corporate accountability. Already got calls from 3 whistleblowers at other companies." Samuel beamed with pride. "Now that's what I call making something good out of something bad." Lorraine squeezed her son's hand. "Your sister exposed the truth, and you're making sure it leads to real change. Together, you're doing what needs to be done." As the evening wound down, Ethan and Amara prepared to leave. The stars were just becoming visible in the darkening sky. The same stars that had witnessed their engagement all those months ago. "You?" "No," Samuel said, walking them to their car. "When you first started dating, I worried about what dating a Bradley might mean for my baby girl. Now I realize it wasn't about the name at all. It was about the person you chose to be, Ethan." Ethan hugged his father-in-law, emotion making it hard to speak. Finally, he managed. "Thank you for showing me what real integrity looks like." The next morning brought more developments. News channels were running endless stories about Bradley Construction's corruption scandal. Former workers continued to come forward with their stories. Social media buzzed with discussions about corporate responsibility and systemic prejudice. But in their new apartment, Ethan and Amara focused on building their life together. They arranged their modest furniture, hung family photos, and created a space that reflected who they really were. "Your mom's charity friends might faint if they saw us in this 2-bedroom apartment," Amara teased as they made their bed. A knock at the door revealed Lorraine, carrying a casserole and a determined expression. "Just because you're married doesn't mean you stop needing your mama's cooking," she announced, sweeping into their kitchen. As they sat down to eat together, Amara marveled at how natural it felt. This simple family meal in their simple apartment, with love and laughter replacing pretense and prejudice. Later that afternoon, they received an unexpected visit from Margaret Whitmore. She arrived bearing a wedding gift and an apology. "I've known your mother since college," she told Victoria. "Watched her build her social fortress brick by brick. But seeing you two stand up for love, for truth, well, it made me question everything I thought I knew about class and status." The gift was a handmade quilt from a local artisan, something the old Margaret would never have considered appropriate for a Bradley wedding present. As the day drew to a close, Ethan received a text from his mother. "Can we talk?" He showed it to Amara, who squeezed his hand. "Whatever you decide, I'm with you." "Tomorrow," he texted back, "but only if you're ready to have an honest conversation about everything. The prejudice, the corruption, the changes that need to happen." Victoria's response was a long time coming. "I'm ready to listen." It wasn't a promise of transformation, but it was a start. Sometimes, Ethan reflected, that's all you can ask for, a willingness to begin the hard work of change. That night, as they lay in bed in their new home, Amara traced the lines of Ethan's face in the darkness. "You know what my mom always says? Truth is like water. It might take the long way around, but it always finds its path." Ethan pulled her closer. "Your mom's a wise woman." "Yes," Amara agreed. "And tomorrow's another chance for that truth to keep flowing, washing away old prejudices, old corruptions, old ways of thinking." Outside their window, the city lights twinkled like earthbound stars, marking the beginning of their new life together. A life built on truth, integrity, and the kind of love that transforms not just two people, but entire families, companies, and communities. The reception hall glowed with warm light as Ethan led Amara onto the dance floor for what should have been their first dance. Instead, he raised his hand, asking for everyone's attention. "Before we dance," his voice carried across the room, "I want to share something with all of you who chose to stay, who chose love over prejudice, truth over comfort. He turned to Samuel. "Mr. Thompson, Dad, would you mind if we did something a little different?" Samuel's eyes widened as Ethan described a traditional African-American wedding custom he'd been researching in secret. The jumping of the broom, a tradition born during slavery when black couples couldn't legally marry, preserved through generations as a symbol of crossing into a new life together. Lorraine hurried home to retrieve the family's heirloom broom, beautifully decorated with ribbons and flowers passed down through 4 generations. When she returned, tears streamed down her face as Ethan and Amara prepared to honor her family's heritage. "In your world," Ethan addressed the remaining guests, "tradition means fancy churches and expensive receptions. But true tradition? It's about remembering where we come from, honoring those who fought and sacrificed so we could be here today." Together they jumped the broom, their leap symbolic of jumping into their new life together, crossing the threshold that separated past from future. The applause that followed wasn't the polite golf claps of society events. Later, as Samuel and Lorraine took to the dance floor, the remaining guests rose in a spontaneous standing ovation. Here was a couple who had faced decades of prejudice with dignity, who had raised their children to be strong and proud, who had shown that character meant more than social status. "Look at them," Derek said to a small group of guests, many of them young professionals from both sides of the tracks. "That's what real class looks like." He'd been approached throughout the evening by people inspired by his family's stand against corruption and prejudice. The mysterious guest who had helped expose Charles's misdeeds introduced himself as Michael Warner, a former Bradley construction project manager. "What happened here today," he told Derek. "It's bigger than just one wedding or one company. People are ready for change." Meanwhile, the band had been joined by members of Lorraine's church choir, transforming traditional wedding songs into something more soulful and alive. The blend of voices and styles created something new and beautiful, much like the union they were celebrating. Amara's cousins taught some of the younger Bradley relatives how to dance, breaking down barriers that had seemed insurmountable just hours before. Laughter replaced judgment, joy overcame prejudice, and music bridged divides that money and status had created. In a quiet moment between dances, Ethan found himself talking with James Peterson, one of his father's oldest business associates. "You know," James said thoughtfully, "I've been to hundreds of society weddings. All that money, all that pretense, never saw anything as elegant as your wife's mother teaching my daughter how to properly swing dance." Across the room, several wealthy guests who had chosen to stay were deep in conversation with Samuel about his construction company's ethical business practices. One of them, a prominent real estate developer, was particularly interested in his worker safety programs. "The industry's changing," the developer said. "After what came out today about Bradley Construction, clients are going to be looking for companies with real integrity. Would you be interested in discussing a partnership?" Amara, surrounded by her bridesmaids, couldn't stop smiling as she watched the unexpected connections being formed. Her best friend Lisa, who worked at a nonprofit, was already brainstorming ideas with Derek about his workers' rights initiative. "Your brother's onto something big," Lisa told her. "All these corporate whistleblowers coming forward, workers, speaking up about safety violations. The timing's perfect for an organization that can coordinate and support them." The celebration continued to evolve, becoming less like a traditional wedding reception and more like a joyful declaration of change. The formal seating arrangement had been abandoned, with guests moving freely between tables, sharing stories and perspectives. Victoria's friend Margaret Whitmore, who had chosen to stay despite her social circle's exodus, found herself seated with Amara's Aunt Marie. To everyone's surprise, they discovered a shared passion for education reform. "We've been running charity galas to fund inner-city schools," Margaret admitted. "But maybe we should have been listening to the communities. We're trying to help instead of just throwing money at them." A young associate from Bradley Construction, who had witnessed years of safety violations but felt powerless to speak up, connected with Mike Warner about documenting other instances of corporate misconduct. Their quiet conversation in a corner would later spark a broader movement for industry reform. As evening deepened, Amara's family traditions began to influence the celebration more openly. The electric slide brought everyone to the dance floor. Social status forgotten as CEOs and construction workers learned the steps together. The Soul Train line that followed broke down any remaining barriers. Samuel watched it all with quiet satisfaction, his arm around Lorraine's waist. "Look at that," he murmured as another group of society folks joined the dance line. "All those years they spent looking down on us, and here they are, learning our dances, enjoying our music, seeing us for who we really are." Lorraine squeezed his hand. Sometimes people just need their eyes opened. Some of them were probably looking for permission to be real, to stop playing those exhausting social games. The catering staff, who had expected to be treated as invisible, servants at a high society wedding, found themselves being drawn into the celebration. Amara insisted they take breaks to join the dancing, and guests began serving themselves from the buffet, the artificial barriers between server and served dissolving. One of the waiters turned out to be a former Bradley construction employee who had been fired for raising safety concerns. His story, shared over plates of food, added another piece to the puzzle of Charles's corruption. Derek was in his element, moving between groups, connecting people who could help each other, building the foundation for his nonprofit one conversation at a time. "This is how real change happens," he told Amara during a quiet moment. "Not through big declarations, but through people from different worlds finding common ground." As the night wore on, Lorraine approached Amara with a small, wrapped package. Inside was a journal, its leather cover worn soft with age. "This was your grandmother's," she explained. "She started writing in it the day she married your grandfather, documenting their fight for respect in a world that didn't want to give it to them. I think she'd want you to have it now." Amara ran her fingers over the smooth leather, feeling the weight of history in her hands. "I'll add our story to it," she promised, "for the next generation." The band shifted to a slower song, and Ethan appeared at her side. As they swayed together, he whispered, "Thank you for showing me what real courage looks like. Thank you for being brave enough to choose love over privilege," she responded. Near midnight, as the celebration began to wind down, spontaneous toasts began. Not the formal, practiced speeches of society weddings, but heartfelt expressions of hope and change. Mike Warner raised his glass. "To standing up for what's right, no matter the cost." Margaret Whitmore stood next. "To learning that true class has nothing to do with bank accounts or social status." Samuel's toast brought tears to many eyes. "To my daughter and son-in-law, who proved that love can break down any barrier, challenge any prejudice, and change any heart that's willing to be changed." The remaining guests formed a circle around Ethan and Amara for one final dance, voices joining in an impromptu chorus of "Lean on Me," a fitting anthem for a day that had begun in division but ended in unity. As guests began to leave, many exchanged phone numbers and promises to stay in touch. The connections formed that evening would lead to new business partnerships, social initiatives, and friendships that crossed all the old boundaries. The catering staff insisted on packing up food for Samuel's construction workers to take home, refusing payment and saying the evening had reminded them what real hospitality meant. The band stayed longer than contracted, caught up in the spirit of the celebration. Near the end of the night, Amara found herself standing with Ethan near the table where her mother had displayed family photos. 4 generations of strong women who had fought for their place in the world. Among them now stood her own wedding photo, marking the beginning of a new chapter. "You know what this means," she said to Ethan, gesturing at the dancing, laughing crowd. "There's no going back to the way things were. Not for any of us." "Good," he replied firmly. The old way needed to change. As the last guests departed, the hall still hummed with the energy of transformation. Wedding centerpieces were given to the catering staff and cleaning crew. Leftover flowers were destined for local nursing homes. Even in its ending, the celebration continued to break down barriers. Derek had collected a stack of business cards and promised connections. But more importantly, he had witnessed the power of bringing different worlds together. His nonprofit would be built on this foundation, the understanding that change happens when people see each other as humans first. The wedding planner, who had initially been skeptical about deviating from tradition, admitted to Lorraine that she had never seen a more beautiful celebration. Because it was real, Lorraine told her. Everything real is beautiful if you look at it with love. As Ethan and Amara prepared to leave, Samuel pulled his new son-in-law aside. "You did more than just marry my daughter today," he said. "You showed everyone what courage looks like. That's a rare gift." The night air was cool as they stepped outside, where their car waited, decorated not with typical wedding finery, but with African symbols of love and unity alongside traditional wedding bells, a perfect representation of their merged worlds. They drove away under a sky full of stars, the same stars that had witnessed their engagement, their struggles, and now their triumph. Behind them, they left a reception hall filled with the echoes of laughter, love, and change. Ahead lay a future they would build together, on a foundation of truth, courage, and the kind of love that transforms not just two people, but entire communities. In their wake, they left something even more precious than memories. They left hope. Hope that love could indeed conquer prejudice, that courage could overcome corruption, that two people choosing to stand together could inspire others to stand up as well. The wedding that Victoria had intended as a display of social status had become instead a declaration of independence from the very systems she had sought to uphold. In its place came something far more valuable, a genuine celebration of love, truth, and the power of choosing what's right over what's expected. 1 year had passed since the wedding that shook the foundations of two families and sparked a wave of change throughout the city. The morning sun filtered through the windows of the courthouse as Charles Bradley stood before Judge Anderson, his perfectly tailored suit unable to mask his diminished presence. "The court recognizes the defendant's cooperation in the investigation," Judge Anderson declared, her voice firm. "However, the severity of these safety violations, spanning decades and putting countless workers' lives at risk, cannot be overlooked." Charles glanced at the packed gallery. Former employees, whistleblowers, and families of workers who had been injured sat alongside reporters and industry representatives. In the back row, he spotted Ethan, not there to support him, but to witness justice being served. The sentence was decisive: 5 years in federal prison, massive fines, and a lifetime ban from serving on any corporate board. As Charles was led away, he caught a final glimpse of his son. Ethan's face showed no triumph, only a quiet resolution. Across town, Victoria sat in a small conference room at the Thompson Community Center, a place she would never have set foot in a year ago. Now, she was here regularly, working with Lorraine on a program to help women from disadvantaged backgrounds start their own businesses. "I still don't understand why you gave me a chance," Victoria said softly as they reviewed applications. "After everything," Lorraine looked up from her papers. "Because holding on to hate hurts the person holding it more than anyone else. Besides," she smiled, "watching you learn to make soul food has been entertainment enough." The transformation hadn't been easy. After Charles's arrest, Victoria had hit rock bottom, shunned by her former social circle, and lost without her carefully constructed identity. It was Margaret Whitmore who had first brought her to one of Lorraine's cooking classes, desperate to help her former friend find a new purpose. That first class had been awkward, with Victoria fumbling over measurements and techniques she'd never bothered to learn. But something about Lorraine's patient teaching and the warm community atmosphere began to crack her carefully maintained facade. Meanwhile, Samuel's construction company had undergone its own transformation. The partnership with Roger Matthews had exceeded all expectations, setting new industry standards for worker safety and ethical business practices. Former Bradley construction employees, freed from their fear of retaliation, had flocked to join them. "It's not just about building buildings anymore," Samuel explained to a trade magazine reporter. "It's about building a legacy of integrity." The article, titled "From Whistleblower to Industry Leader," detailed how Samuel's stand against corruption had inspired a movement for reform throughout the construction industry. His worker safety programs were being adopted as models across the country. Derek's nonprofit, Workers' Voice, had grown from a small office above his father's construction company to a national organization with branches in 12 cities. The mysterious guest from the wedding, Michael Warner, had become his right-hand man, helping other whistleblowers navigate the complex process of exposing corporate wrongdoing. "Remember when you pulled me aside at your wedding?" Derek asked Amara during a family dinner. "Told me to be patient, that change takes time? Well, look at us now." The Thompson living room had become a regular meeting place for an unlikely coalition of social activists, business leaders, and former society figures who had chosen conscience over status. Margaret Whitmore's Education Reform Initiative had merged with Lorraine's Business Mentorship Program, creating opportunities for underserved communities. Even James Peterson, Charles's former business associate, had become an unlikely ally. His construction supply company now exclusively partnered with contractors who met Samuel's ethical standards, forcing other companies to either reform or lose business. Ethan and Amara's modest home had become another kind of sanctuary. They hosted monthly dinners where people from all backgrounds could connect and share ideas. The formal dining rooms and elaborate table settings of Ethan's past had been replaced by mismatched chairs and potluck dishes, creating an atmosphere where authentic conversations could flourish. "Sometimes I catch myself missing the old life," Ethan admitted to Amara one evening as they cleaned up after such a gathering. "Not the prejudice or the pretense, but the simplicity of knowing exactly who you were supposed to be." "And now?" Amara asked, loading dishes into their dishwasher. A task his mother would have delegated to staff. "Now I know who I actually am. It's harder, but infinitely better." Their influence had spread in unexpected ways. Several of Ethan's former colleagues had left prestigious firms to start practices focusing on worker advocacy and corporate accountability. The Bradley name, once synonymous with power and privilege, was being redefined by Ethan's commitment to justice. Victoria's journey toward redemption had perhaps been the most surprising. After months of working with Lorraine at the community center, she had sold her mansion, donating most of the proceeds to establish a foundation supporting minority-owned businesses. "The funny thing is," she told Amara over coffee one morning, "I always thought losing our social position would destroy me. Instead, it freed me to become someone I actually like being." The conversation was interrupted by Lorraine bursting in with news. Her first group of business mentees had all secured startup funding. Among them was a young woman who had once worked as a maid for the Bradleys. "She's opening her own cleaning service company," Lorraine announced proudly, "with fair wages and benefits for all employees." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "I used to think people like that lacked ambition," she admitted. "I never realized they just lacked opportunity." Changes rippled outward. The country club that had once been the center of Victoria's social world now hosted job fairs and community events. Society matrons who had followed Victoria's lead in shunning Amara now sought her advice on meaningful philanthropy. One year, to the day after their wedding, Ethan and Amara hosted an anniversary celebration in their backyard. The guest list spanned all social and economic backgrounds, creating exactly the kind of gathering that would have horrified Victoria a year ago. Samuel manned the grill while Lorraine and Victoria worked side by side in the kitchen, their easy cooperation a testament to how much had changed. Derek set up a table with information about Workers' Voice, next to Margaret's education reform. Materials. As evening fell, Samuel called everyone's attention. "A year ago, we watched love triumph over prejudice at a wedding that changed more than just two lives. Today, we're not celebrating just Ethan and Amara's marriage, but the birth of a movement." The gathered crowd raised their glasses, crystal champagne flutes mixing with mason jars and paper cups in a perfect metaphor for their new reality. Later that night, after the guests had gone, Ethan found Amara in their study, writing in her grandmother's journal. "Adding our chapter?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her shoulders. "It's wild to think about. she said, leaning back against him. My grandmother wrote about fighting for the right to love across color lines. My mother wrote about building a life in a world that didn't want to accept her. And now I'm writing about how love can transform not just two people, but entire communities. Their peaceful moment was interrupted by Derek arriving with breaking news. 3 more major construction companies had agreed to adopt Samuel's safety standards. The movement they had started was growing faster than anyone had anticipated. Dad's going to need to hire more inspectors. Derek grinned. Turns out integrity is contagious. The next morning, Victoria arrived at the community center early, setting up for another cooking class. The woman who had once measured her worth in designer labels and social connections now found joy in teaching others to make biscuits from scratch. You've come a long way, Lorraine observed, watching her carefully arrange mixing bowls. Thanks to you, Victoria replied. You could have rejected me, but you saw something worth saving. That's what family does, Lorraine said simply. As summer turned to fall, the changes they had sparked continued to grow. Samuel and Roger's ethical construction initiative had spread to 3 more states. Derek's nonprofit had helped expose safety violations at 20 more companies. The community center's business program had launched 50 new entrepreneurs, but perhaps the most profound changes were the quietest ones. The way Victoria now genuinely hugged her students instead of air kissing. How Ethan had learned to fix things around their house instead of calling service people. The pride Amara felt introducing herself with her hyphenated last name, representing both her heritage and her future. Charles, serving his sentence, had begun writing letters. Real ones, not the carefully crafted legal responses of his past. To former employees, apologizing for putting profit over their safety. To Samuel, acknowledging the damage he'd done. To his son, finally beginning to understand the true meaning of legacy. One evening, as autumn leaves danced in the wind, Ethan and Amara sat on their small porch, drinking coffee from mismatched mugs. A group of kids played basketball in their neighbor's driveway, some from the wealthy north side, some from the working-class south side, none of them caring about the differences that had once seemed so important. Remember what you said at our wedding? Amara asked. About choosing love over hate, integrity over privilege? Ethan nodded, pulling her closer as the evening air grew cool. Look at all the others who made that choice because we showed them it was possible. Inside, their wedding photo sat on a shelf alongside Amara's grandmother's journal and a piece of the broom they had jumped together. Beside them stood a framed article about Samuel's company revolutionizing industry safety standards and a picture of Victoria teaching at the community center. The stars emerged overhead. The same stars that had witnessed their engagement, their wedding, and now their triumph. They had done more than just overcome prejudice in their own lives. They had sparked a movement that continued to grow, touching lives far beyond their own families. Their love story had become something bigger than themselves, a testament to the power of choosing what's right over what's easy, of standing firm in the face of prejudice, of believing that love really could change the world, one honest conversation, one broken barrier, one opened heart at a time. What would you risk to stand up for love? If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of courage, love, and justice. Your support helps us share stories that matter. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear what this story meant to you. Remember, change doesn't always need a protest or a parade. Sometimes it just needs 2 people brave enough to say I do and